Hello and welcome, everybody. This is your host, Chuck Walkendorfer, President of Distribution from Think2Perform. We are bringing you the First Citizens You First series titled Improved Decision Making and Stress Management. Our topic today is stress and its impact on performance. Think2Perform is a business and sports consulting firm founded in 2002, based in Minneapolis. And we work with executives, athletes, and business owners to improve decision making under pressure. Our clients include everyone from American Express to United Health Group, the FBI, doctors and nurses in surgery, the Minnesota Vikings, Minnesota Twins, all in an effort to improve decision making under pressure. And First Citizens sought us out to bring you this series during these uncertain times. And so you'll be hearing me, along with other colleagues of mine from Think2Perform, talk about how you can improve your own performance in decision making, especially during all the uncertainty we've had in 2020. Here's what you can know about performance. Performance in any area of life. I don't care what you do for a living, where you live, the color of your skin, male or female, it does not matter. Performance in any area of life is a function of three things. Number one is talent. Talents are things that we were always good at, can never really remember learning, things we had a natural ability for. So maybe things like math or music or sports. Part number two of performance are skills. So skills are things we develop over a lifetime. So I may have had a talent for music and I developed a skill to play the piano. And the third part of performance is decision making. So it's talent plus skill plus decision making equals performance. And of the three, decision making has twice the impact on performance than talent and skill combined. I am not suggesting that talent and skill don't matter. They do. They just don't matter as much as decision making. And unlike our IQ, which we can't improve, we can't unfortunately get any smarter. We can, with practice and focus and effort, become better decision makers. And we make about 35,000 decisions a day. Does that surprise anybody? Most of them we don't think about. So brushing your teeth in the morning, how you take your coffee, when we used to go to the office, how you drove to work. We tend to live our lives out of a part of our brain called the basal ganglia. That's the habit center part of our brain, and it frees up the logical thinking part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, to make the bigger decisions of the day. So this series is all about how to improve decision making and performance. Specifically, what we're talking about today is stress and its impact on performance. And as we've all been experiencing, these are some very uncertain, very stressful times. In our first session, you heard Dave and I talk about the fact that when uncertainty increases in life, when uncertainty or ambiguity increases in life, so does our stress level. And with an increase in our stress level comes a decrease in our ability to manage our emotions, make good choices, and manage our own behavior. Now, we don't need to make all 35,000 decisions a day better, but we've probably got to make 2 or 3 decisions better a day. And we'll talk about how to do that. And 2 or 3 decisions better a day is 500 to 1,000 better decisions a year. And so the impact on our life and our performance can be significant. Now, today I'm joined by one of my Think2Perform colleagues, one of my favorite Think2Perform people, Dave Meldal. Dave is a senior vice president at Think2Perform, and he focuses his work on developing leaders and teams through deepened self-awareness, interpersonal effectiveness, and moral and emotional competence. His clients are from a variety of industries, including financial services, biotech, retail, government, and healthcare. Before joining Think2Perform, Dave ran his own coaching, training, and consulting firm for 6 years. And prior to entering consulting, Dave worked over the span of 24 years for American Express, developing leaders and teams across the United States. As an adjunct faculty member, he also taught the Leadership Foundations course at Montana State University for several years. Thousands of leaders and training participants have put Dave's practical expertise and insights he prompts into action. Dave is a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Communications from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, and a Master's in Education in Human Resource Development from the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis. Dave and his beautiful wife, Cindy, live in their little slice of paradise in Bozeman, Montana. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Chuck. Good to be back with you again for this second session. I'm honored to be on the journey with you. and for citizens.
Fantastic. I want to jump in here today. There's some questions I'd like to ask you before we get going, and then talk to us about this uncertainty and stress. What's the connection between the two? What's your point of view here?
Yeah, yep. And well, I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what you said, Chuck. The first thing to just remember, right, uncertainty triggers stress. So as uncertainty goes up, stress goes up, and we'll talk a little bit later about good stress and bad stress and all that jazz. But this connection to uncertainty is real, and it's rooted in our brain, as you mentioned, because our brain likes to predict, right, what's going to happen. And so that frees up that processing capacity to focus on the more important or complicated tasks.
Mm-hmm.
So when uncertainty goes up, stress goes up, and generally some not good things happen as a result of that. And I'll give you an example, a recent one. I'm guessing all of our listeners have heard the phrase walking on eggshells. Well, part of my coaching work, I was working with a business owner recently, and as part of that process, I interviewed his whole team individually. And what they shared with me, and what the client was unaware of, was that his emotional demeanor was a crapshoot. And by that I mean they didn't know if today he was going to show up that happy, positive leader that he was the day before, or that fly off the handle, kind of irritable person that he is on some days. So they were highly uncertain, right, as to what person's going to show up. They literally had no ideas. So because his emotions and related behaviors were so unpredictable, their stress levels were going up, right? They were walking on eggshells, and that took mental energy for them to kind of figure out what's kind of sense his mood, if you will. Should they approach him now or later, or if at all, on particular topics, rather than dealing kind of openly and candidly with what was going on.
And so I'm guessing that took mental energy away from other things that they would have normally been working on.
Exactly. And so their performance individually and collectively gets diminished, right? Because they're thinking about, okay, what's the right way to approach him about this topic now, given the mood that I sense he's in, right? As opposed to just thinking about the issue, they're thinking about the context of this person's behavior or likely response to their question, or them sharing a point of view that maybe was different than their own. So the diversity of opinion gets kind of thrown out the window. It's all's a big word. Let me backtrack that. A lot of energy is taken trying to figure out the person and how to approach him, as opposed to the issue at hand. And that's not good for either party, for the organization, for that matter.
Yeah, it's got to affect the performance. It's got to slow things way down. So in a business, especially these days, when your business, your decision making, your performance matters even more than ever, it's actually working against you, because they're worried about what kind of mood their boss is going to be in today, instead of thinking about how they can perform better.
Right. Exactly. Now, one other corollary to that experience that I want to share is that not every team member had the same experience, right? So, or perceived experience. So my point about that is that how uncertainty triggers stress in each of us will vary to a certain degree, right? So the exact same uncertain event, if you will, in this case, the leader's behavior, might cause me, Dave, a lot more stress than it would cause you, Chuck, right? Because that's, maybe you've worked with him longer, you've kind of figured that how to read him a little bit easier. You've been able to cope with it in ways that are more productive than I have, or you just have a different attitude towards it, and it's less of a big deal, right? So I think it's just good to remember that those differences exist among us, and that can help us empathize a bit more with each other versus overly judging each other's reactions to similar events. So we're just more apt to cut each other some slack, if you will,
so
knowing those individuals.
If you don't mind me going back to this example, Dave, with this person, the business owner that you were working with, how did you help him?
It is all, well, you mentioned it a bit ago around self-awareness. The first step, Chuck, was to help him be aware of the impact that he was having on others. So sharing the feedback, helping equip them to have candid conversations with him, helping him recognize in the moment what he was experiencing,
Mm-hmm.
and equipping him with some tools to kind of walk himself back from getting what we call, you and I know, the amygdala hijack, so he didn't get hijacked emotionally in the moment. So we spent, this was over the course of months, right, equipping him to deal more effectively with the stress that he was experiencing that got, other people stressed as well. So, and that's the cool thing about what we're doing with this series, right, is equipping people with different ways of thinking about situations that may cause them stress, more apt to align with what they're trying to accomplish, their goals. So I'm just excited about this whole series. It will be kind of equipping everyone with a set of tools and concepts that I think will help them.
And we'll give our audience today some tools that you can begin using in your own life. So some of the tools that maybe you talked with your business owner about in terms of how you deal with stress, because COVID's out of our control. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We talk about, focus on what you can control. The only thing I can control is my own behavior. Right? So there are some things I can do, and we'll talk about those later today. About, while I can't control COVID, what can I do to improve my stress capacity and how I respond to stress? And, it reminds me of a conversation, Dave, I had a couple of weeks ago with a colleague talking about how different 2020 is from 2008, 2009. In 2008, we had stock market uncertainty.
Yeah.
The stock market was dropping, and we're going to talk about the difference between a bear in the woods and a bear market. But in 2020, we've got not only stock market uncertainty, we've got economic uncertainty. Many of us have health uncertainty. You've got uncertainty in your children going to school, uncertainty in your workplace, and all of that rolls up to be what could be a debilitating level of stress unless we know, number one, to your point, that we're aware of the level of stress in our lives, and number two, if it's overwhelming or incapacitating to us, what to do about that. So,
Right on.
Talk to us about this difference between bear in the woods and bear in the stock market. What's up with
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. It's a great analogy or great example of what's going on in our brains. Frankly, back to that neuroscience, right? So, to our brain, coming across a bear in the woods triggers fear. Experiencing a repeated downward trend in the market does the exact same thing to our brain. So our brain is experiencing a bear market in the same way that it's experiencing a bear in the woods, and that's with fear, right? So living in Montana, as I do, and you, Chuck, in Colorado, this is a possibility, right? Let's talk about the bear in the woods first. So I've actually experienced this. I've come across a bear in the woods, and I can tell you that what happened like that was some serious fear. Now,
Yeah.
luckily for me, I'll give you the end of the story. This was a young black bear. It wasn't a mother with her cubs. That would have been a whole different story.
Mm-hmm.
But my brain responded very quickly, as we know, very quickly, that fear kicks in, right? Along with that, all sorts of hormones start coursing through my body, right? To prepare me to do what? Survive, right?
Right.
That's the name of the game here. That's what our brain is wired to do, is help us survive. It's going to sacrifice accuracy for speed, and in this case, it's about survival, right? So adrenaline is going through me to help me run or to fight. I got cortisol preparing me if I need to clot my blood faster. All sorts of other hormones. Unfortunately, what's happening is the more rational part of my brain, the prefrontal cortex, is not as engaged, right? It's sitting on the bench, if you will. So at this point, it's all about survival in the heat of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, my brain is preparing me to fight or flee. And what we know, those of us who live in bear country, is if we could actually engage our prefrontal cortex, we know that fighting or running are really not going to work very well, right? there are other techniques to survive a bear encounter than those we won't get into. But on the other hand, with a bear market, my brain perceives it the same way, right? Fear. I see this market tanking, boom. If it's intense enough, the same physiological stress response happens, right? All those hormones get into me. I'm not thinking as clearly. And if I'm not aware that that's happening, that my rational part of my brain is on the bench, if I'm not remembering that that's true, my emotional brain might take over and lead me to, in many cases, what we find with investors, right, is making a rash decision of selling too much, too fast at the bottom of a tough market. And a better response, because this is not actually life-threatening like a bear, right, just to recognize the fear for what it is, and understanding that making an emotionally driven decision too hastily is not probably the best idea, right? And it's
Right.
what I can do, though, is take the time to calm down and engage my rational brain in working through the options, hopefully with my financial advisor, right? So it's just knowing the difference, right? That this is not about survival. It feels like that to the brain, but in reality, it's not.
Yeah, the physiological response is the same, and it reminds me of something that we covered in our first session, which is we are hardwired to be emotionally reflexive.
Yep.
Meaning, when I feel something, my body wants me to respond very quickly. And emotions tend to sacrifice accuracy for speed. They want us to respond very quickly and are usually wrong. So to your point around the bear in the woods, running from a bear in the woods is the wrong choice. The harder
They're
choice
fast.
is to stand there, right? And the same would be true about a bear market. We don't want to run in a bear market because then we lock in our losses. And that's, to your point, Dave, where our First Citizens Wealth professional can help us manage those emotions, calm down, think more clearly, and make better choices. Right?
Right on. Yep.
So talk to us about, like, what do we do with this fear and like anxiety? How can we deal with that ourselves, and how does that
Yeah.
impact us?
I think it's the first thing is to understand the differences, right? That because they're similar in some significant ways, but they're different too. In terms of similarities, both are experienced by the brain as a response to a sense of danger, right? So it's back to the brain. And remember that the uncertainty, be that with COVID, the stock market, or whatever, from the brain's point of view, that's a type of danger, that uncertainty. And they're both natural part of the way we are as humans, right? And they actually can serve a positive purpose. So let's look at fear first. Fear is usually a reaction to very specific danger, like in the bear example in the woods. And I think about in the era of COVID, right? If I were seated on a plane, we've just taken off, and then I learned from whoever that the person behind me got through screening somehow but had tested positive for COVID recently, I can bet you big time, right, that I am going to be experiencing a pretty significant level of fear, right? Because it's a very specific here and now danger or threat. Once that threat is removed, the fear subsides. So with the bear, when the bear moves off, whew, big sigh, I can recover, right? Same thing on the plane. If I can get off the plane, or the person moves, or we put on masks, all that stuff, that fear can subside a bit, right? But it's all about survival. That's what fear, it serves that purpose, right? Anxiety, on the other hand, is less of a response to something very specific in the here and now, like fear. It's more of a generalized, vague feeling. I think about it as the anticipation, if you will, of a threat that might be occurring in the future.
Right.
So I could be worrying excessively about the market and what's going on. In my own personal example, and you've heard me share about my mom, right? So she's 2 hours away over in Billings, 89 years old, and she's in an independent living situation, which is awesome. But they're in kind of a lockdown situation, right? So what's going through my head, Chuck, is will she be okay? What if some worker comes in inadvertently that's been exposed to the virus and brings it in? Then I think about emotionally for her. What's the impact of her greater isolation because we can't see her in the same
Right.
ways that we've seen her before? What if she got sick, right? We couldn't see all those things swirling around in my head, lead to higher levels of anxiety if that's what I'm focused on. Um, so they're different, right? Now, the positive aspect to anxiety I want to mention is that at least at normal levels, anxiety can keep us vigilant, right? It's helping us prepare for the unexpected, kind of that Boy Scout, be prepared. It might even help us increase self-discipline, right, as we seek to prepare for things that we are looking towards in the future. So there's some positive aspects to that as well. The downside is these cognitive distortions that pop up.
Yeah, so they really affect our ability to think clearly and make good choices, I'm guessing.
Exactly,
Probably
and that's
lead to
what's
some sleepless nights as well, I would imagine.
well, yeah, especially with my mom. It's like, oh my gosh, what? And then of course add into the fact that Cindy's mom she's 88 and in the exact same situation out in Minnesota, right? So uh, with those of us at that age, we're kind of the sandwich generation. We've got elderly parents and we've got children that are launching or launched, and there are plenty of things to worry about, aren't there?
Well, absolutely. And I'm guessing, Dave, this is kind of maybe a little bit of a silly question, but it underscores the point. You know, I'm guessing you're not really able to set that aside. Like you don't ever forget about your mom, you forget about your mother-in-law as you go to work or, move on with your life. It's always there. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think that's true. It is always there. So it's a kind of a low grade
Yeah.
level of anxiety. What I don't want it to become, and I think unfortunately for some, amidst what's going on in 2020, that low grade kind of constant anxiety that it comes out of love for others and
Hmm.
wanting to make a difference in whatever you're doing, that low grade anxiety might be kind of a moderate level of anxiety these days. And that's the cool thing is, Chuck, that this series is all about helping people learn how to manage their stress, learn how to cope with challenging situations so that their decision making in the moment is effective.
So
And
what should our
yeah,
audience be watching for, Dave? Like what are some things like how do I recognize this in myself?
I think a few things, Chuck. There are probably many more that we could cover if we had more time, but a few to pay attention to. And I like the fact that we've said in yourself and others. It's not just about yourself. Look for this in your loved ones and others you care about as well. But I would think about if I'm not listening quite as well, right? Uh, I'm overly focused on what's going on in my head, and I'm not focused on the experience of the other that I'm interacting with. So if we're not listening quite as well as we normally would, that could be a sign of a heightened level of anxiety. We might just have a bit shorter fuse, right? We're getting impatient and short, and our interpersonal relationships are maybe getting a little bit experiencing some tension, if you will. And then from a time perspective, what are we thinking about? And I also think about what are we consuming, right? From a media perspective,
Right.
is that causing us to think about things that we would maybe not worry as much about, but because they're so present, we just get sucked in, right?
Hmm.
So those are a few things that I think about.
Yeah, so those are some things we need to be paying attention to ourselves, but then we may also notice this in other people.
Right. And when we do, I think an empathetic and helpful question to ask from a sincere perspective is, you know, you don't seem like yourself. There might be something going on. What's on your mind?
Mm-hmm.
And that simple statement might just open some dialogue, right, to a conversation about what they're experiencing. And I think it's good to ask ourselves that too.
Well,
You
and
know
I think
what?
I think too, it maybe gives you some backstory to what might be going on in somebody's life that we're not aware of. We also might be able to help people get unstuck.
Yes.
Sometimes some of the hardest things one of the hardest things to ask for sometimes is some help. And unless we're able to demonstrate some empathy here and say, Dave, I notice something's going on for you. What's happening? What's on your mind?
Yep.
All right. Rarely do things that we hold inside go away. They usually get bigger. And so if we want to help others get unstuck, we got to ask about it, unpack it, put it on the table. Let's deal with it because it's rarely going to go away. So talk to us about stress and its impact on performance.
Yeah. Let's get into that. And the fact is that not all stress is bad, right? It can kind of get a bad rap, if you will. But the reality is that stress is necessary in the right doses. It can help us, as we'll talk about, perform better. The issue is how much stress and for how long.
Mm-hmm.
So think about our muscles. You know, if we lift weights, any kind of exercise it's actually literally stressing the muscle,
Mm-hmm.
right? And over time, that will become stronger. And if we don't stress it, it will atrophy over
Right.
time. So that's a good thing. I mean, and then psychologically, think about maybe giving an important presentation. It's a good thing generally to be a bit keyed up,
Yeah.
right, before you're giving your presentation. So because what that does is help you really focus on the task at
Raise your
hand.
game. Right.
Right on. Even though the butterflies, right, can be a bit unsettling, being a bit keyed up is helpful. We're kind of in that zone, if you will. The
So
problem is,
go ahead.
well, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think, using your exercise example, it's one thing to go to the gym and work out. It's another, if we exercise too much. So if I go to the gym and work out 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, what happens to my body is I start to get hurt. I start to get sick.
You're gonna wear out.
I wear
Right.
myself out. And so it's knowing where I am on this curve and then what I can begin to do to either reduce my stress if I'm on the other side of the curve where my performance is suffering, or improve my stress capacity, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes.
Yep. Yep. I call it the Goldilocks moment, right? That at the peak,
Yeah.
it's not too little stress, it's not too much, it's kind of just right, because there's diminishing returns on the other side of it as well.
Dave, is there such a thing as too little stress?
I think so. I mean, looking at the curve, right?
Yeah.
Our performance isn't at the peak on the low side of stress either.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that presentation being keyed up, we said it was a good thing, kind of having those butterflies. Well, what if I just took it totally for granted? It was just totally nonchalant, overconfident. I might go in there and just totally forget, my main points. It was just, I wasn't keyed up enough.
Not be on your game.
Not be on your game. And my favorite example is in sports, right? Miracle on Ice.
Right.
1980.
Yeah.
Russians, I would say, my guess is that they were not at peak performance, right? And I would say they were on the left-hand side of that curve, taking for granted this, bunch of hick amateur Americans playing hockey against this powerhouse Russian dynamo, right? And I think they underperformed because they were probably a little bit too nonchalant, overconfident. Their stress level was not at its optimum point.
Great example. So how do you see this performance or stress curve playing out now amongst this pandemic?
Yeah, that's real stuff right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess first let me just comment on the individual differences again, because we are each responding differently to what's going on. So I think it's important to remember that the amount of stress that I'm experiencing might be too much for me, but for you, Chuck, it's okay, right? So those individual differences, I think, exist. What's happening, I think, on the downside since March anyway, is that so much has been coming at us. I think about families,
Mm-hmm.
right, at home with kids. The parent is trying to work at home. They've got kids that are either underfoot or the parent is actually having to engage in the teaching process with them. They're playing a much larger role, the parent is, in care for loved ones, either here or they're thinking about them wherever they may be. And I just wonder about the impact, right, of all that on the performance, if you will, of the parents, both at work and educationally. So it's, I guess, the volume and scale, Chuck, of so many competing demands on people during this time is just it's tough.
Starts to take its
Uh,
toll.
it takes its toll. Now, again, I think I hear many stories where for some, the time at home with their kids has been a major silver lining
Mm-hmm.
for them, right? So our tolerance for and our response to stress is a very individual thing, which I think is a great lead into the stress assessment that we are encouraging folks to take.
So
Talk to
to
us about that, Chuck.
piggyback on what Dave's talking about, individual levels of stress, you should have, along with this recording, a 14-question stress assessment to get an idea of, like, what's the level of stress in my life? How is that impacting me? So what you'll notice is there's 14 questions. Treat each question separately. Give yourself a reasonable estimate, and I would encourage you to be honest. This is for you, not anybody else. You can have other members of your family take this assessment as well. At the end of the 14 questions, you'll total your score. The assessment looks something like this. And here's what I'll say, a couple things around the results of the assessment. Your score today is just your score today. So it's an indication of what my day has been like, how's my week been, maybe even my month. And so it's an exercise in self-assessment. Back to Dave's point is, what level of stress do I have going on in my life? And then what we're going to do is answer the question, so what? So what do I do about that? So let's take a look at your score. Assuming you've answered the 14-question assessment, here's what your score means. An average level of stress is 18 to 21 points. So that's where maybe I'm performing at my best, maybe even 22, 23, 24 points where I'm a little bit tested, a little anxious, I got to be on my game. If you're down around 11 or 12 points, it could mean that you're living a very low stress life, which is possible. You might be on maybe I could be doing more to challenge myself. It could also be a defense mechanism. So sometimes when we have high stress lives, we tend to check out as a way to kind of protect ourselves. So that's also what a lower score around 11 or 12 points could mean. Anything over 26 points, it's beginning to affect our judgment or critical thinking. Over 30 points, we've got an issue. Over 40 points, we've got a real problem, right? And so we want to be paying attention to that. Now, what that does beg the question is, what do I do about that? Answering what I call the so what question. So if I recognize I'm in a high stress environment, there's nothing I can do about COVID. My job situation is what it is. I've got my kids going home or living at home and going to school, right? There's some things we can begin to do to improve our stress capacity. So things like drinking more water, getting a little bit more rest, getting exercise, eating regularly throughout the day, meditation or yoga. Those are all things that we can do to increase our stress capacity, while we might not have control over things that will decrease our stress, right? We don't know how long COVID is going to go on. We don't know what's going to happen in the stock market. What we can control is our own behavior in taking care of ourselves through this time. I make that point because the first thing we cut out during periods of high stress is we tend to exercise less. We don't get as much rest. We don't eat regularly throughout the day. We don't drink as much water. And we can get by with that for 4 or 5 days, maybe even a couple of weeks. But over a couple of months, like we've been experiencing here with COVID, it begins to have a decreasing impact on our stress. And ultimately, back to our stress curve, have it be on the downside of this stress curve. So you want to be paying attention to some of the things that you can begin doing for yourselves to improve your stress capacity. So with that, we're going to bring things to a close. We thank you for your time and preparation and attention here today. Our next session will be on the leadership logic chain. I'll be joined by one of my other Think2Perform colleagues, Ray Kelly. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things we talked about here today with Dave, you can contact Kyle DeBell at kdebell@think2perform.com. We would encourage you to reach out to your First Citizens professional or associate. You can reach them at firstcitizens.com. With that, on behalf of Dave Meldal and myself, we thank you for your time and attention. Have a great rest of your week.